I've always prided myself on being a family man. In my culture, coming from a small town in Southeast Asia, family isn't just important, it's everything. It's the foundation of who you are. When I moved to the U.S. 10 years ago, I carried those values with me. I wanted to build something meaningful, a life rooted in love, respect, and hard work. That's why meeting Susie felt like destiny. She was everything I wasn't: outgoing, confident, and full of life. She had a way of lighting up a room, commanding attention without even trying. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and from the moment we started talking, I was hooked. She seemed fascinated by my background, asking a million questions about where I came from, my traditions, and the food I grew up eating. It felt refreshing, like she truly appreciated my differences. We got married 3 years later, and for a while, it was bliss. We bought a cozy house in the suburbs, had 2 beautiful boys, and settled into what I thought was a happy, stable life. I worked long hours in upper management at a tech company, while Susie balanced a part-time accounting job with taking care of the kids. Every night, we'd come together as a family, eating dinner, playing with the boys, and catching up on each other's day. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. But looking back now, I see the cracks that were always there, hidden under the surface. Susie grew up in a household that couldn't have been more different from mine. Her parents encouraged independence and personal freedom above all else. She made decisions on her own, rarely consulting me, which often felt jarring. Back home, my family would talk through even the smallest choices, ensuring everyone was on the same page. For Susie, this was stifling. For me, her way felt isolating. At first, I chalked it up to cultural differences. I thought, this is just how things are in America. I'll adjust. And for a while, I did. I ignored the moments when Susie brushed off my opinions or rolled her eyes at my more traditional views. I told myself it didn't matter, that our love was strong enough to bridge those gaps. But then things started to change. Slowly, subtly, like the way water wears down a stone. It wasn't just the cultural divide anymore. Susie seemed distant. She stopped asking about my day or sharing hers. Our once vibrant evenings became quiet, strained. I noticed her on her phone more, laughing at messages I wasn't privy to. And the way she talked about our life, it was always I, never we. I tried to bring it up once, gently. Susie, I said one night as we sat on the couch, do you feel like we're drifting apart? She laughed, brushing it off. Jack, you're overthinking things. We're fine. But we weren't fine. And deep down, I think we both knew it. It all started within. A few months ago, a new woman joined Susie's accounting team. Her name came up one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner. Anne's great, Susie said, stacking plates in the dishwasher. She's so fun, and she gets me, you know? Plus, her boys are the same age as ours. That's nice, I replied, not thinking much of it. Susie had always been social, and it wasn't unusual for her to make fast friends. Soon, Anne and her family became regulars at our weekend barbecues. From the moment I met her, something about Anne felt off. She had this sharp, commanding presence, the kind of woman who spoke first and laughed loudest. Her husband, Paul, was the exact opposite, quiet, almost timid. I could tell he'd been worn down over time, constantly walking on eggshells around her. Anne's influence on Susie was immediate. Within weeks, Susie started talking more like her, brash, sarcastic, and dismissive of things she once valued. When I suggested a family outing one weekend, she rolled her eyes. Why don't you take the boys yourself? I deserve a break too, Jack. It wasn't just her words, it was her attitude. Susie had always been headstrong, but now there was an edge to her, like she was daring me to push back. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. And encouraged Susie's newfound independence, often planting ideas I knew weren't entirely Susie's own. You should take more time for yourself, she'd say, or, Jack's so traditional, isn't he? You need to live a little. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, but the more I watched them together, the more it became clear and wasn't just a friend. She was a catalyst. Susie started going out more, dinners with and drinks after work. "It's just the girls," she'd tell me, waving her phone in the air as she grabbed her coat. "Don't wait up." At first, she'd come home by 8 or 9, a little tipsy but still cheerful. Then it became 10, then 11:30. One night, she didn't walk through the door until nearly 1 a.m. When I asked where she'd been, her response was curt. "We got caught up talking." It's not a big deal, Jack. It was a big deal to me, though. Back home, couples didn't behave this way. Nights out were rare and always planned together. The idea of a wife going off with friends until the early hours of the morning, leaving her husband home with the kids, was unheard of. But every time I brought it up, Susie dismissed me. "You're so old-fashioned," she'd say with a laugh, as though that explained everything. It wasn't just the late nights. Susie was changing in other ways too. She started dressing differently, tighter jeans, lower-cut tops. Her phone became a permanent fixture in her hand, and when I asked who she was texting, she'd shrug. "Just Ann." I tried to keep things together for the boys, telling myself this was just a phase. But the more I watched her pull away, the more I realized this wasn't about me being old-fashioned or traditional. Something deeper was happening, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And then one evening, as I was tucking the boys into bed, I overheard Susie on the phone in the kitchen. "No, he doesn't know anything," she said, her voice low but hurried. "It's fine. He's too busy being the perfect husband to notice." I froze in the hallway, my chest tightening. She wasn't talking about me, was she? When I walked into the kitchen, she hung up quickly, her face flushed. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Justin," she said, smiling too brightly. "We were talking about work stuff." But I didn't believe her. Not anymore. By the time Susie started going out regularly, I'd stopped asking questions. Every Wednesday night, she'd grab her coat and keys, give me a half-hearted smile, and say, "Don't wait up, Jack." And every Wednesday night, I'd sit in the living room, pretending to watch TV while my mind raced with unanswered questions. The first few weeks, she came home around 8 or 9, just as she promised. "It was fun," she'd say when I asked about her night. "We had a couple of drinks, talked about work, girl stuff." Her clothes smelled faintly of cigarettes, a habit I knew and had, and she'd head straight to the shower. "Ugh, I hate that smell," she'd complain. But soon, her nights started stretching longer. 10 p.m. turned into 11:30. Then one night, it was nearly 1 a.m. when I heard her key in the lock. I waited for her in the living room, flipping on the light as she walked in. "Jack," she yelped, clutching her chest. "You scared me." "What are you doing up?" "Waiting for you," I said calmly. "It's late." She glanced at the clock on the wall and shrugged. We lost track of time. And was telling me about her husband's latest drama. "You wouldn't believe the stuff she puts up with." I didn't respond. I just watched her as she kicked off her heels and headed for the shower. "I smell like smoke again," she called over her shoulder. "I'll be quick." It didn't sit right with me. None of it did. Susie wasn't the type to lose track of time. And while I wasn't proud of it, I started paying closer attention. I checked her clothes after she left them in the hamper. They did smell like smoke, but also something else, something faint and musky that made my stomach turn. One night, I noticed her underwear wasn't in the laundry. I found them hanging over the shower rod, freshly rinsed. When I asked her about it, she waved me off. "And dared me to try those stupid karaoke cocktails," she said with a laugh. I spilled one all over myself. "Don't worry, nothing crazy happened." But I wasn't so sure. Every week, the distance between us seemed to grow. She stopped reaching for my hand during movie nights or laughing at my jokes during dinner. Even our intimate moments, which had always been the one constant in our marriage, became strained. The nights after her outings, she'd climb into bed and turn away, saying she was tired. It was like she was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. Then came the night that changed everything. She was getting ready to leave, fixing her hair in the mirror while I sat on the edge of the bed. "Another Wednesday night with Ann?" I asked casually. She shot me a quick glance in the mirror. "Yeah." "Why?" "No reason," I said, though my chest tightened. "Just wondering what you guys talk about every week." Susie paused, her brush hovering in midair. "What's with all the questions, Jack? You're not jealous, are you?" "Should I be?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She rolled her eyes, setting the brush down with a thud. "You're ridiculous. It's just dinner and drinks. You want to come? You can sit there while Ann talks about how useless her husband is. That sound fun?" I didn't answer, and she didn't wait for one. Grabbing her purse, she leaned down and kissed me on the cheek. "Don't wait up," she said with a smirk before walking out the door. That night, I couldn't sit still. I paced the house, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it all in my head? Was I just being paranoid? Or was there something Susie wasn't telling me? It was almost 12:15 when I heard her key in the door. This time, I was waiting in the living room. When she stepped inside and saw me sitting there, she froze. "Jack," she said, her voice strained. "What are you doing up?" I stood slowly, keeping my gaze locked on hers. "Waiting for you," I said. "And for the truth." The moment Susie saw my face, I could tell she knew the game was up. Her expression shifted from surprise to irritation as she dropped her purse on the floor. "What are you talking about, Jack?" she said, her voice feigning innocence. I didn't move from where I stood, my arms crossed. "I've been patient, Susie. But I'm done waiting. I want to know what's really going on during these girls' nights with Ann." She let out an exasperated sigh, like I'd asked her to explain the obvious. "Oh, come on, Jack. It's just dinner and drinks. You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Am I?" I asked, my tone sharp. "Because it doesn't feel that way when you're coming home past midnight, smelling like a mix of smoke and something else. It doesn't feel that way when you're washing your underwear in the shower instead of putting them in the laundry. And it definitely doesn't feel that way when you're distant and cold every time you get back." Her eyes widened for a moment before narrowing. "You've been checking my laundry?" she snapped. "Are you serious right now?" "Don't turn this around on me," I shot back. "I wouldn't have to check if you'd just tell me the truth." She hesitated, crossing her arms. "Fine," she said finally, her voice defensive. "If you must know, and I go to a club sometimes. It's not a big deal. We dance, we have fun. That's it." I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was lying. "And what kind of club is this?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "It's just a bar, Jack. Relax." But something about her tone didn't sit right. "Just a bar, huh? So why does Ann's husband think otherwise?" Her head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I had a little chat with Paul," I said, stepping closer. "He seems to think you and are doing a lot more than drinking and dancing. Something about hooking up." Her face flushed red, but whether it was from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "Paul is a drunk," she snapped. "You're seriously going to believe him over me?" "I don't know, Susie," I said, my voice low. "Should I?" She glared at me, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "You know what, Jack? I'm sick of this. Sick of your constant suspicion, your old-fashioned ways. I'm allowed to have fun. I'm allowed to have a life outside of this house." "A life outside of this house," I repeated, shaking my head. "Susie, I've supported you in everything. I've worked my ass off to provide for this family, to give you the freedom to do whatever makes you happy. But this isn't fun. This is betrayal. She threw her hands up in exasperation. Oh, please. Don't act like a victim, Jack. This isn't about you. It's about me. I've spent years living up to your idea of a perfect wife, and now I just want to breathe. Is that so wrong? Not if it's just breathing, I said, my voice tightening. But that's not what this is it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned and walked to the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. You're making a big deal out of nothing, she said over her shoulder. If you don't trust me, that's on you. I stood there, watching her, the weight of her words sinking in. She wasn't going to admit it. Whatever she was doing, she decided she wasn't going to tell me, not because she was innocent, but because she didn't care enough to fight for us. For the first time in our marriage, I felt truly alone. That night, Susie went to bed without another word. I stayed up in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. My mind raced with possibilities, my heart heavy with doubt. I needed to know the truth, and if she wasn't going to give it to me, I'd find it myself. I tried to keep it together for the boys. They didn't deserve to see the cracks forming in our family. But every day, it got harder to pretend. Susie's late nights continued, and her excuses became even flimsier. Anne's going through a lot, she'd say, or, we just lost track of time again. The spark in her eyes was gone when she looked at me, replaced by something colder, more distant. The turning point came one Wednesday night when I decided I couldn't sit idly by anymore. After she left, I waited 10 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I'd overheard her mention a place called the Iron Grove during a phone call within the previous week, and something told me that's where she'd gone. When I pulled into the parking lot, my stomach twisted. The Iron Grove wasn't just a bar, it was a club, and not the kind I'd imagined. The bass thumped loud enough to shake the windows, and a line of people stretched around the block. Couples and groups laughed and chatted, dressed in clothes that left little to the imagination. It wasn't the type of place Susie and I would have ever gone together. I parked across the street and waited, my heart pounding. About an hour later, I spotted her. She came out through a side door, laughing with and a group of men. One of them, a tall guy with broad shoulders and a cocky grin, wrapped his arm around her waist as she leaned into him. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. There was no mistaking what I was seeing. She wasn't just dancing with friends or blowing off steam. She was with him, her hand on his chest, her face tilted up toward his. I wanted to storm over there, to demand answers, to call her out in front of everyone. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched as they disappeared back inside, and trailing behind them with a knowing smirk. When Susie came home that night, it was almost 2 a.m. I was sitting in the dark, waiting, my anger simmering just below the surface. She jumped when she saw me, clutching the doorframe for support. "Jack," she exclaimed. "What are you doing up? Where were you?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. She hesitated for a split second before giving me that same practiced smile. "Out with Anne. You know, just the usual." "The usual," I repeated, standing up. "Is that what you call letting another man put his hands all over you?" Her face drained of color, but she quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her tone defensive. "I saw you, Susie," I said, stepping closer. "At the Iron Grove. With him." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. Instead, she crossed her arms and glared at me. "So what if you did?" she said, her voice icy. "It's not like you've been any fun to be around lately. Maybe if you weren't so uptight, I wouldn't need to go out and have fun." Her words hit me like a slap. "Fun?" I repeated, my voice trembling with rage. "That's what you call cheating on me? Breaking our vows? Betraying your family?" "Oh, give me a break," she snapped. "You're so dramatic, Jack. It's not like I'm in love with the guy. It's just something I need right now." Something you need? I said, my fists clenching. What about what I need? What about the boys? Do we mean so little to you? She rolled her eyes, turning away. This isn't about you, Jack. Or the boys. This is about me. For once in my life, I'm doing what makes me happy. If you can't handle that, maybe you're the problem. I stared at her, my chest heaving with the weight of her words. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even pretending to be. All the love, the respect, the partnership I thought we had, it was gone. Maybe it had been gone for a long time, and I'd just been too blind to see it. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of lying next to her. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, one thing became clear: I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions for the boys' sake while my mind raced. Every time I looked at Susie, it was like staring at a stranger. The woman I'd married, the mother of my children, was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Someone who had no qualms about destroying everything we'd built together. She didn't apologize. She didn't even try to explain herself. Instead, she carried on as though nothing had happened, as though my feelings, and our marriage, were insignificant. Her arrogance, her complete lack of remorse, lit a fire in me. I knew I couldn't let this go on. I had to act, but I also had to be smart about it. One evening, after the boys were asleep, I sat Susie down in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. She sighed, crossing her legs as if I were an inconvenience. "What now, Jack?" "I've been thinking about everything," I began, choosing my words carefully. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I've been too rigid. Too traditional." Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. "I want to understand your perspective," I continued. "If this is what you need to feel happy, then maybe it's time for me to be more open-minded. Maybe it's time I embrace this new lifestyle." Her lips curled into a slow smile, her posture relaxing. "Really?" she asked, tilting her head. "You're serious?" "Serious enough to make a suggestion," I said. "I think we should take a trip. Just the two of us. Somewhere away from the kids, away from everything. A chance to start fresh." Susie's smile grew wider. "Jack, I never thought I'd hear you say that. I think it's a great idea." "I've already booked us tickets," I said, pulling 2 plain itineraries from my pocket. "Cape Verde Islands. Beautiful beaches, no distractions. Just you and me." Her excitement was palpable. "Jack, this is perfect. When do we leave?" "This Sunday," I said. "I've made all the arrangements. I even cleared it with, and she's happy to help with the boys while we're gone." Susie leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. "I'm so glad you're finally coming around," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You won't regret this." But I knew better. This wasn't about compromise or salvaging our marriage. It was about survival. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me any longer. We arrived at the resort late Tuesday afternoon. Susie was in her element, chatting up the staff, marveling at the ocean view, and soaking in the attention from every man who glanced her way. I played along, smiling and nodding, acting like the supportive husband she'd always taken for granted. That evening, I met with a man I'd contacted weeks earlier, Winston Mugabe. He was everything Susie admired in a man: tall, confident, and dripping with wealth. To her, he would look like a dream come true. To me, he was the answer to my problem. Winston and I finalized the details over drinks in the resort restaurant. He'd agreed to my terms and transferred the money that afternoon. Everything was set. All I had to do was wait. When Susie joined me for dinner, she looked stunning, her sun-kissed skin glowing under the soft light. She noticed Winston at the next table and leaned in close. "Who's that?" she whispered, her eyes sparkling. "Just a businessman I met earlier," I said casually. "Why don't I introduce you?" Her interest was immediate. I watched as she turned on her charm, leaning forward to laugh at Winston's jokes, hanging on his every word as he regaled her with stories of his life in Africa. By the time dinner ended, she was practically glowing. "Why don't we take this party upstairs?" she suggested, her hand brushing Winston's arm. "I'm sure Jack won't mind." But Winston had other plans. "Actually," he said, "I was thinking you might like to see my yacht. It's docked just down the beach. We could spend the evening there, just the two of us." Susie didn't even look at me for approval. "I'd love that," she said, her voice breathless. I watched them leave together, Winston's hand resting possessively on her lower back. As they disappeared into the night, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest began to lift. That was the last time I saw Susie. Susie didn't return to the hotel that night. I didn't expect her to. I spent the evening packing her things into her suitcases, careful to leave no trace of my involvement. By morning, one of Winston's security guards arrived at my door. He didn't say much, just nodded, took the luggage, and handed me an envelope. Inside was a receipt for the final wire transfer, enough money to secure my children's future and my independence. I watched the guard walk away, carrying everything that had tied Susie to my life. When the door clicked shut, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. It was done. I stayed in Cape Verde for the rest of the week, playing the role of a vacationing husband to anyone who asked. I strolled the beaches, wandered through the local shops, and spent hours sitting by the ocean, letting the waves wash away the remnants of my anger. When my scheduled flight home arrived, I boarded it alone. The boys were thrilled to see me when I got back. I hugged them tightly, savoring the purity of their joy. They asked about Susie, and I told them she had decided to extend her stay for a while. It was a lie, but one I needed to tell, for now. The truth came out a few days later when Ann called, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Where's Susie?" she demanded. "She hasn't answered any of my texts." "She met someone in Cape Verde," I said simply. "She decided to stay." And laughed, though it sounded forced. "Oh, come on, Jack. What did you do?" "Nothing," I replied evenly. "She made her choice. And now, I've made mine." And didn't believe me. A few days later, she showed up at my door with a man who introduced himself as a detective. He asked if I had filed a missing person report. I told him there was no need, Susie wasn't missing. I handed over the documents Winston had provided me, copies of Susie's passport, showing her exit from Cape Verde and her arrival in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The detective examined the papers carefully, his brow furrowing. "She moved on," I said with a shrug. "She's living the life she wanted." And looked furious, but there was nothing she could do. The detective nodded, thanked me for my cooperation, and escorted her back to his car. I couldn't help but notice his hand resting on her back as they walked away. Perhaps Susie's betrayal had rubbed off on Ann, too. Using the documents Winston provided, I filed for divorce. The process was surprisingly smooth. With no way for Susie to contest it, the judge granted me full custody of the boys and ownership of the house. The divorce was finalized within months, leaving me free from her manipulative grasp. I poured myself into rebuilding my life. The boys became my focus, and I worked hard to give them a stable, loving home. Friends and family rallied around us, offering support and encouragement. Slowly, we found our rhythm. About 6 months later, I was sitting at a cafe when Paul, Ann's husband, approached me. He looked better than I remembered, his shoulders were straighter, and the nervous twitch in his hands was gone. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat across from me. "Go ahead," I said, curious about what he had to say. He sat down, fiddling with the edge of his coffee cup. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. "Whatever you did, it worked." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had an idea. "Ann's gone," he said with a faint smile. "She told me she was taking a vacation, but she never came back. I got an email from her a few weeks later, saying she met someone and decided to stay in Africa. I nodded, suppressing a smirk. Sometimes people make choices that surprise you. Paul looked at me, his expression serious. You're lucky, Jack. You got out. And now I have, too. As he stood to leave, I noticed the lightness in his step. For the first time, he seemed free. I didn't feel regret. Not for Susie, not for Ann, and certainly not for the choices I made. I'd spent too long being a prisoner to someone else's selfishness. Now, I was free to live life on my terms, to raise my boys with the values I'd once let slip away. Susie had wanted excitement, adventure, something beyond the life we built. And she got it. But I was done chasing her fantasies. I had my own life to live, and I wasn't looking back.